You're standing in the middle of nowhere, high desert, red rock, dead silent, and something massive passes overhead, blocking the sun for a second. You look up, and what you see doesn't look like a bird so much as a small aircraft gliding past. No flapping, no effort, just this enormous dark shape riding the wind like it owns the sky. That's a California condor, and here's the part almost nobody knows. 40 years ago, that moment couldn't have happened anywhere on Earth. Not because the bird was rare, because it didn't exist outside of a handful of cages anymore. In 1987, scientists made a decision that sounds almost unbelievable now. They caught every single wild condor left on the planet, all 22 of them, and locked the entire species away from the wild completely. For the first time in millions of years, this bird, one of the oldest flying species alive today, had zero presence in the sky. Some scientists at the time called it a death sentence dressed up as a rescue plan. They were wrong. What happened next turned into one of the strangest comeback stories in American wildlife history, and it's still unfolding right now, in the same skies you might be standing under someday. Stick around, this one gets stranger the deeper you go. To understand how a bird this massive ended up on the edge of total extinction, you have to go back further than most people would guess. The California condor isn't some recent species that struggled to adapt to modern life. It's ancient. These birds were soaring over North America during the last ice age, sharing the skies with woolly mammoths and saber-toothed cats, feeding on the carcasses of massive Pleistocene animals that don't exist anymore. When most of those giant mammals went extinct, around 10,000 years ago, condors lost their main food source almost overnight. And here's the twist most people don't expect. That ancient extinction event nearly took the condor down with it, thousands of years before humans ever entered the picture. The species barely held on, surviving along a narrow strip of the Pacific coast, scavenging whatever large carcasses washed up on shore or wandered through the hills. By the time European settlers arrived in California, the condor population had already shrunk dramatically from its prehistoric range. And what came next made things far worse. As the American West was settled, condors faced an entire list of threats stacked one on top of another. They were shot, sometimes out of simple fear of such a massive, unfamiliar bird, sometimes by ranchers worried they might prey on livestock, even though condors don't hunt live animals at all. They're scavengers, feeding only on what's already dead. Egg collectors raided nests for prize specimens. Power lines, a brand new hazard these ancient birds had no evolutionary defense against, electrocuted birds with wingspans wide enough to touch two lines at once. And quietly, underneath all of it, something even more dangerous was building up in their bodies with every meal. Condors are scavengers. They eat carrion, the carcasses of dead animals left behind by hunters, ranchers, and natural deaths across the landscape. For most of history, that wasn't a problem. But once lead ammunition became standard for hunting across the American West, every carcass a condor fed on became a potential poisoning. A single lead fragment, swallowed along with the meat, is enough to slowly shut down a condor's nervous system. And because these birds can travel over 100 miles in a single day searching for food, there was no way to avoid it. The very food source that had sustained them for thousands of years had quietly turned into a slow-acting trap. By 1967, the federal government listed the California condor as endangered. But here's where the story gets uncomfortable, and this is the part that should genuinely surprise you. Listing a species as endangered doesn't automatically save it. Through the 1970s, despite legal protections on paper, the wild population kept dropping. Scientists watched, year after year, as the number of condors left in existence shrank towards single digits in some local populations. By 1982, the final wild count came in at 22 birds, not 22 breeding pairs, 22 individual condors, total, representing the entire remaining population of one of the largest flying birds on the planet. And the people responsible for saving this species were about to make a decision so drastic, so controversial, that some scientists at the time argued it amounted to giving up entirely. In 1987, with the wild population down to a handful of birds, scientists made the decision that would define the entire condor recovery effort. They went out and captured every single remaining wild condor, all of them, and brought them into captivity. The last bird taken in was a male known as AC9, trapped on April 19th, 1987. The moment he was caught, something happened that had never occurred before in recorded history. For the first time, the skies of North America held 0 wild California condors, not a rare sighting, not a struggling remnant population. 0. The species existed only behind fences, in breeding facilities at the Los Angeles Zoo and the San Diego Wild Animal Park. At the time, this decision tore the conservation community apart. Plenty of respected scientists argued it was a mistake, even a betrayal of what the species represented. Their reasoning made sense on the surface. If a bird only exists in captivity, is it really still wild? Some claimed the species was now functionally extinct, no matter how many individuals were still breathing. But the people running the recovery program were betting on something else entirely, that having 0 condors flying free was infinitely better than watching the species disappear completely, one poison bird at a time, with absolutely nothing left to rebuild from. Here's the part that makes this story stranger than most people expect. Condors are agonizingly slow breeders. They don't reach sexual maturity until they're 6 to 8 years old. Once paired, a couple produces just a single egg every 1 to 2 years. In nature, that's a recipe for a slow, steady population. In an emergency recovery situation with only 27 total birds left on Earth, it's close to a nightmare. So, scientists developed an unusual workaround. They started removing each egg as soon as it was laid. Losing an egg early triggers a condor pair to lay again, sometimes even a third time in a single season. It's called double or triple clutching, and it effectively multiplied the number of chicks each breeding pair could produce in a year. But removing the eggs created a new problem. How do you raise condor chicks without letting them imprint on humans? A condor that grows up thinking it's human won't know how to survive, hunt for food, or even recognize other condors as potential mates once it's released. So caretakers came up with something that sounds almost absurd until you understand why it worked. Hand puppets, shaped like adult condor heads. These puppets were used to feed and interact with the chicks, so that every single thing a young condor associated with food, comfort, and care came from something that looked like its own species, never a human hand or face. It worked. Chicks raised this way grew up behaviorally normal, recognizing themselves as condors rather than imitation humans. By 1988, just 1 year after the species went extinct in the wild, the first captive-bred condor chick hatched in San Diego. Within a few short years, the captive population, which had started at 27 birds in 1987, was climbing steadily. And in 1992, the recovery team made their next move, releasing 2 captive-bred condors back into the wild skies of Southern California for the first time since the species had vanished from them entirely. Nobody knew for certain whether birds raised by puppets and zoo enclosures would actually be able to survive out there. They were about to find out. The early releases didn't go as smoothly as anyone hoped. Captive-bred condors, raised without wild parents to teach them the unwritten rules of survival, made mistakes their ancestors never would have. Some landed near power lines and were electrocuted, the same threat that had plagued the species for decades. Others showed too much curiosity around humans, approaching campsites and buildings instead of staying wary, behavior that had to be actively trained out of later generations of release candidates using aversion techniques before they ever left captivity. Recovery, it turned out, wasn't just about producing more condors. It was about teaching an entire species how to be wild again, almost from scratch. And underneath all of it, the original threat that had pushed the species to 22 birds in the first place was still very much active. Lead poisoning didn't disappear just because the condors had been bred in captivity and released with tracking tags. Every time a free-flying condor fed on a carcass left behind by a hunter using lead ammunition, it risked the same slow poisoning that had devastated the wild population decades earlier. To this day, every single wild condor is captured twice a year, just to test its blood for lead levels. Birds testing high are treated through a medical process called chelation, essentially flushing the toxic metal from their system before it kills them. It's an extraordinary, expensive, ongoing intervention. And here's the part that should make you pause. Without it, scientists believe the wild population still couldn't sustain itself on its own, even now. But here's where the story turns from cautionary to genuinely remarkable. In 2003, more than 15 years after every wild condor had been pulled from the sky, a chick successfully hatched and fledged in the wild in Arizona, the first time that had happened in decades. California followed with its own wild-hatched chick the next year. Then, in 2007, came a moment scientists had been waiting for since 1987. A California condor laid an egg in the wild, in a place where no condor had nested freely in nearly 60 years. And in 2008, the recovery program crossed a threshold that once seemed almost impossible. For the first time since the captures began, there were more California condors flying free in the wild than living in captivity. Today, the global condor population sits at several hundred birds, more than half of them soaring free across California, Arizona, Utah, and Baja California, Mexico, the same range their ancient ancestors covered before humans nearly erased them. Every single one of those birds, every wild condor riding the wind above the Grand Canyon or the California coastline right now, descends from those original 22 individuals caught between 1982 and 1987. Not a relative, not a related species reintroduced from elsewhere. The literal genetic legacy of 22 birds rebuilt one painstaking puppet-fed chick at a time. The condor still isn't out of danger. Lead poisoning remains an active, ongoing threat, and the species depends on constant human intervention just to hold its ground. But what this story proves is something worth sitting with. Even when a species is reduced to a number you could fit in a single school bus, extinction isn't always the end of the sentence. Sometimes, with enough stubbornness, enough strange ideas like condor head puppets, and enough people refusing to let go, a species gets a second chance to fill the sky again. If stories like this are the kind of thing that genuinely fascinate you, let me know in the comments which part surprised you most, and stick around for more.